I have been asked to make a tape about the early history on Captiva Island as I have heard it from the John R. Dickey family, my husband's father and mother.
Family on Captiva Island begins back in the very early 1900s. Dr. J.A. Dickey, an M.D. from Bristol, Virginia, went fishing on Sanibel before that and came home and told very tall tales to his brother, Dr. John R. Dickey, about the fabulous fishing and the wonderful weather there in the wintertime. Maybe that year or the year after, Dr. John R. Dickey, who was a pharmacist, proceeded to lose his voice, at least this is what I was told, and he decided the best thing to do for him would be to take the family and go down on that island, and maybe he wouldn't have so much trouble with his throat. So he rented a house on Sanibel Island, which is still standing, and packed up his family, his wife, 3 children, a cook. I don't know who all went that first year, which was 1905. Ernest Dickey was 4 years old, and they settled on Sanibel. Immediately, Grandma Dickey went to the beach and loved the shells and made one of the most beautiful shell collections I have ever seen. It's been a great joy for me to have it here in the home and have people come and see it. But Dr. Dickey had to take a horse and buggy and go all the way across Sanibel Island to fish. He didn't like that. So, in thinking about it, he heard about Captiva Island, and he went up to Captiva by boat and proceeded to walk up and down the island until he found the narrowest, very narrowest place on Captiva Island, also the highest, and he bought half a mile of Captiva Island so that Grandma could shell on the beach and he could fish in the bay. He bought this property from Mr. Binder, who was one of the 6 homesteaders living on the island at that time. Then he had to find a man to build him a house, and he did. Toad Bryant, another one of the homesteaders, got together with Dr. Dickey, and they drew some plans, probably on a piece of cardboard, and built that home in the, I believe, during the summer of 1906, which is the home, which is the Dickey home on the island now. The next year, when the Dickeys left in the fall to come down, they of course came by boat as they had before out of Fort Myers. Occasionally they came to Fort Myers, occasionally they came from Punta Gorda. But usually Fort Myers, and they stayed in Fort Myers with Miss Flossie Hill's mother, and then took the boat out to the bulkhead, which was out in the bay off of where Andy's dock is now, and the boat, all of their goods were unloaded there. They had trunks of clothes, they had barrels, they had boxes, flour, barrels of flour, barrels of sugar, boxes of canned goods. Grandma didn't want them left on that bulkhead all night, so they loaded them in little boats and took them ashore farther up the island, intending to unload those small boats the next morning. Next morning, when they went to get them, they found the little wavelets had sunk the boats. Everything was wet. Sugar and flour was somewhat resurrected. Grandma's silk dresses had to be washed and hung out to dry. The labels had come off of the cans, so the food that winter was rather interesting. They never knew what they were going to eat. So they all settled down on the house, in the house on Captiva. What did they have to make things comfortable? They had a dock out in the bay with a 4-holer on it. candles, and lamps. This was starting in 1907. The boys learned everything about boats. They learned never to throw anything away because either had to go to Punta Gorda or Fort Myers to get even a nail. The washing was done at the place. The baking was done. Everything was done right there. Grandma did have a cook, and there was a yard man came down with them to help, and various members of the family, Grandma Dickey sometimes, Grandma Hobson sometimes, and it was just a real family affair. Mrs. Dickey, Mrs. John R. Dickey, was a concert pianist. Her father was a Lutheran missionary to this country from Germany, so as a young girl, she went abroad and studied for 3 years, and then did some concertizing, and came to Bristol, and met Dr. Dickey, and married him, and raised his 3 children by his first wife, and 4 children, and 3 of her own. She continued with her piano work, and she had a piano on the island, and played beautifully, and I'm sure many of the islanders enjoyed her music. One of my favorite stories is Mary Bailey, who was a resident of the island many, many years, saw a little old lady chopping wood for the fireplace one day in the yard, and wondered who in the world that was. And later on, she heard a piano being played, and peeked in the window, and the little old lady that was chopping the wood was playing so beautifully. And she told me this story. What I've put on this tape up to this time, of course, has been hearsay. I met Ernest Dickey in 1919 when we both attended Stetson University, and he began to fill me up with tales of Captiva. So I learned more about Captiva probably the first 5 years that I went with him before I married him than I've ever heard since. Stories that many of you know, and maybe I'll add some of them to this tape. My first trip to Captiva was Christmas week of 1923. He met me in Fort Myers with a boat because there were no ferries yet, and of course no causeway. I'm sure when my father put me on the train into land to come to Fort Myers, and by the way, it took me 2 days, I spent the night in Lakeland, that he thought he'd never see me again because he was deathly afraid of the water. Captiva was quite a shock to me. As I said, I had to get used to a few things, but oh, it was so beautiful and so wonderful, and oh, the fish were so good, and the fishing was good, and I had a great week. That was, as say, the Christmas week of 23. Ernest Dickey and I married on the 6th September of 1924. During those early years, the Dickeys went down in November and took a tutor for the children. There was no school on the island. And then they came back to Bristol in time for the boys to finish with their class at high school. And this went on for several years with different tutors. I don't know exactly when, but I'm sure somebody does, the 3 Dickey boys built a little house on the north end of the Dickey property, the south end of the Dickey property, for their tutoress, Miss Fitzpatrick from Richmond. Miss Fitzpatrick occupied it, had parties there, and I have pictures of that, as I have of many other things. And later, the Prices from Bristol bought it, and that was the beginning of Tween Waters Inn. And the entrance to the dining room of Tween Waters at this particular time is the original little house. And when Tween Waters remodeled this past summer, 1979, 1980, they left the front, redid the front similar to what it was and have left it very much as Grace Price would have wanted it, and I think this is wonderful. It seems to me that I'm only talking about the Dickeys, but after all, that's what I know most about. Grandma Dickey had the first Sunday school on the island in her living room, gathered some of the children together, and when we took over the house in 1952, I found the hymn books that they used. Also, the first library on Captiva was in what is the office or the scatter room in my home. And Mrs. Dickey, Mrs. Herman Dickey, Evelyn Dickey, Mrs. Trilla Hicks Rouse, and Mrs. Hicks, and Mrs. Kay, and I don't know who else worked in that library. It's fun to think that it started there. Also, Grandma Dickey was the president of the first Civic Association. I don't think they called it that then. I found among the things in the home some notes that she had made and the original library sign. I turned those over to the library, and they are probably in some cupboard there now. The Dickey home was the first winter residence to be built on Captiva Island. The second one was built by Dr. Hicks, also from Bristol, and built on the same plan as the Dickey home, but is turned differently, so you really don't notice it. As far as I've been able to find out, the Dickey home now is the oldest home on Captiva Island. The Toll Bryant house was washed away when Redfish Pass went through about 1920 or 21. There's been quite a bit of controversy about when Redfish Pass went through, but I tell them very frankly that it must have gone through before 1927 because I fished in it, through it, the winter of 1923 when I visited on Captiva Island. The last winter that Ernest Dickey spent on Captiva was the winter of 23-24. He used his boat to guide Mr. Chadwick. He made a little bit of money. He got $10 a day, used his own gasoline, and at the end of the season, he cleared $70. It wasn't really enough to get married on, so we had to wait until fall. But we laughed about it because everything came out all right. Many well-known people have visited Captiva, and of course, the one that so many people are interested in was the visit of Teddy Roosevelt. We have pictures of Teddy and Colonel Cole with Dr. and Mrs. Dickey on the porch, and one wonders why they came there. Well, Teddy was after devilfish, and he pitched a camp on a barge in the bay, and of course the closest dock was the Dickey dock, and they would come ashore and come and sit and rock in the big rockers on the porch. They spent a great deal of time on the beach. They spent time in boats. They went over to the Snyder School, which I'll tell you about later, and were generally up and down the island. At those early years, and when I first heard about Captiva, they called that part of the island, the bay going south, the Horn. But since Teddy's visit, it has been Roosevelt Pass. The little island across from Captiva, Buck Key. Early in the 1900s, there were 7 families living over there. There were beautiful citrus groves. Some of the best grapefruit I ever ate came from over there. It's my understanding that some of them are fishermen, but there was also a school and a boarding house or hotel. The Snyder School, which I mentioned earlier, which was a traveling school for boys, spent their first winter in the South over on Buck Key because the hotel on the mainland had burned before they could occupy it. Later, they rented, and then bought a hotel on Captiva Island. As time went on, Dr. Dickey had so many guests. The building of the Dickey Hotel, it stood where Belton Johnson's home is now, and was run by a lady that Dr. Dickey hired from Buck Key and her son. It was quite well known and had postal cards that were sent out to advertise it, and I have one in my photograph album of some of the fishermen whose names we know, and showing their beautiful catches. Later on, the Snyder School, which had been on Buck Key for a while and was a traveling boys' boarding school, rented and then bought the hotel. It ran the last season of 1923-24, and then the school was closed. Later on, the building burned. Belton Johnson then bought the property and built his home there, and he and Miriam are best neighbors to all of us up and down that part of the island, and I'm sure over the rest of the island. Ernest spent as much time as he could on the island as years went on, and we had a wonderful time, made many good friends, and I know that he hated to leave it. He passed away in 1968 in Fort Myers and is buried in Bristol, Virginia. I hope to occupy the home for years because I love it there too, and love all the friends that I have made there. Yes, who looked us up because of former friendship with the Dickey family, and also many boys who attended the Snyder School and remembered the Dickey boys. I have one or two rather interesting stories. I think the post office story from way, way back, when the first post office was in the corner of the living room of one of the old homes there, where the lady was postmistress, or postmaster as they call them now. And they were afraid that they might lose their post office on the island. So Dr. Dickey, who was a manufacturing druggist, brought his bills when he came in the fall and sent them out from the little post office in the corner of that living room. The post office people began to wonder what was going on and sent an inspector out to see why there was such a large volume of mail from a little, almost barren island. I have been asked so many times about the name, the Dickey Lane name, which is north of the store on Captiva. It so happens that Dr. Dickey bought a piece of property in about 1907 or 1908, I think, from beach to bay, and sold it in 1910. But it has turned up through various times, and at the time that he bought it, he did dedicate a right-of-way from beach to bay for the fishermen. I think this does go to the bay now, but I don't know about the way over to the beach. I had some discussions with a lawyer out of Fort Myers on this several years ago, and the information that he had gathered and the decision on that is filed in the library. I have already told about Teddy Roosevelt. We've had other famous people on the island, many of whom I didn't know about, but one of whom most of us do know about, and that was the Charles Lindbergh family. Their first winter on Captiva was spent in the green bungalow just south of the Dickey home, which is owned and occupied by Marie Dickey Coleman. Later, they built a home of their own and spent several winters. The notes for Gift of the Sea were made on Captiva Island, and this book has become very popular all over the world. Also, something that not many people possibly know about, although there is one picture of her in the photograph album in a group, was Sylvia Crest of the Crest 5 and 10 cent store. Spent a winter or two on the island and went to school to the tutor that the Dickey boys had and was good friends. Of course, I never met her, but I have heard Ernest talk about her. Another picture in the album shows the Ringling yacht passing by. Whether it ever stopped, I don't know, but the picture is there and is captioned. Back in the good old days of no causeway and no ferry, we had a mail boat, which practically everybody on the island knows about. If not knows about, they've heard about it. And the things that mail boat did for people on the island is almost unbelievable. Almost anything that you needed, the captain or the first mate would shop for you and bring it out. The first time we went down with our children, we had milk delivered in a bucket of ice from the mainland. One story I like very much was Mrs. Trula Hicks Rouse had a companion with her, then becoming later on in life and becoming rather feeble. And at that time you could write a grocery list on a postal card, not in a letter, to the home trade store in Fort Myers. You gave it to the postmistress. She sent it by the mail boat. It was delivered to the home trade store that night, and next morning the groceries were brought to the boat, the mail boat, and brought back out to the island. So they had 24-hour grocery service on the island. This time they took a card into the home trade store, and it was not signed. They looked at the list, realized that many groceries were really needed, so they filled the order, took it down to the mail boat, and the mail boat took it into the post office and asked the postmistress, who sent that order? The postmistress knew exactly who it was. It was Mrs. Rouse's housekeeper that had made the order and received the groceries. Julie Wiles was that postmistress, and she was postmistress following her mother and grandmother, and took care of all of us, just as our postmistress that is on duty now, and we've always depended on them and loved them.
That's it. Back when the grandmothers came, it was Grandma Dickey from Peach Bottom Creek in South Virginia, or Southwest Virginia, and Grandma Hoffman, who was the widow of a Lutheran missionary to the States from Germany. She was the mother of Mrs. John R. Dickey, who was the wife of John R. Dickey, who built the home. Sometime during the early days, a picture was taken of the Ringling yacht going south in what was then called the Horn. The water was on the north end narrowed, hence the name. Now, I mean the water on the north end was very wide and narrowed down, hence the name at that point. After Teddy Roosevelt's visit, it became known as Roosevelt Pass. Another famous resident of the island years ago was Albert Spaulding, who lived just south of the S curve. I understand he had a beautiful concert grand, and he was a famous violinist. I have been asked about Ernest and my family. We had 4, 2 boys, 2 girls. E.H. Dickey Jr. married Doris Thompson. They have 2 sons, Doug Dickey, who married Pat Alexander. They have 1 son, my first great-grandson, Matthew. Ernest Martin Dickey graduated May 28th with a music degree, the major on timpani. Margaret Dickey, Germanus, married Fred Germanus. They have 1 daughter, Kathy Lee. Both parents attended Stetson, and the daughter also. The daughter, Kathy, married Stephen Burley, who also graduated from Stetson. John Douglas Dickey married Susie McRoberts. Both attended Stetson. They have 5 children, William Hatcher, Kimberly Ann, Gregory, Jeffrey Douglas, and Lynn. Eleanor Hoffman Dickey, my youngest, married William C. Orr, a research psychologist. They have 2 children, Sheffley and Natasha. Eleanor has a master's on piano, concertizes, and teaches. She was also a specialist on timpani through high school and college. They all love Captiva and come as often as they can. They love to hear the old stories, and I try to tell them all I can. I will be 80 in 1982, and I can only hope the next 80 years will be as good as the first. I do wish that my Ernest could still be here to enjoy it all with me.